Welcome, everyone. Thank you for making it to today's session on blended finance for small island developing states with a focus on the Caribbean. Greetings to everyone. My name is Heiner Scalix. I'm the Senior Advisor at Convergence for Latin America and the Caribbean, and we're looking forward to the next 60 minutes of a rich conversation around blended finance and applicability towards the region and insights from the experience of a great panel that we have. Just before we get started, some housekeeping rules. Please rename yourself and your organization so that we know who you are and who you represent. Stay on mute, please, to avoid sound disruptions. If you have a question, you can either raise your hand towards the end or just type it in our chat box. And if you feel comfortable when you are speaking, you can turn your camera on. Otherwise, please keep it off while others are presenting. So just a refresher, what exactly is blended finance, or what are we talking about when we mention blended finance? Blended finance is a structuring approach. It is the strategic use of catalytic capital from public or philanthropic sources to increase private sector investment in emerging markets or developing economies. So it is a structuring approach. Three of the key considerations that we also look for these transactions or deals or solutions that are blended finance in nature. One, they must have a return, a financial return, an overall return, generally a component that services the private sector investment under market rates. The second has to do with impact. It should be addressing an additional SDG at the very least. That's in addition to SDG 17, which is Partnership for the Goals, which by definition a blended finance transaction already is because of the several different stakeholders that form part of that solution. And finally, leverage. It's that actual use of that philanthropic catalytic capital or concessional capital that enables the deal to be created, and perhaps the deal would not have been created, launched, or enabled or executed had it not been for that component. So it brings the transaction to life. Next slide, please. For those who are not familiar with Convergence, who are we? We are the Global Network for Blended Finance. One of our goals is to narrow the financing gap that's required to reach the SDGs, and that financing gap is currently at around $4.5 trillion. And how do we do that? By providing and working across four different pillars. One has to do with guiding on thought leadership, donor advisory services, and deal insights and intelligence, publications of reports like our State of Blended Finance, case studies and data briefs. We provide an education component as well, which is member learning programs and customized capacity buildings, online learning modules like the one we are in today. We connect the different stakeholders by providing networking opportunities and peer-to-peer learnings of those stakeholders in the economic development space as well as the investment space. And finally, we mobilize resources by running several initiatives like our design funding programs, and as well as the possibility to have your transaction posted for additional visibility. So with that, and to not take more time away and turn it over to Sneha, who will kick it off from here, and we look forward. And thank you once again for being here with us this morning or this afternoon. Sneha?
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Heiner. And thank you all for joining us today. So joining me on stage today are four of our members and representatives from their organizations. So please do join me in welcoming Keisha Farnham, Director of Public Sector Projects at the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, Donna Francois, Program Officer IT at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Shanique Albury-Smith, Deputy Director, Caribbean Division at the Nature Conservancy, and Eduardo Carrera, CEO of Platform for Social Impact. If you could all please turn on your cameras and join me on screen with my warm welcome, and thank you for joining. Great, I can definitely see you all. It looks like perfect. To get started, I'd love to ask each of you to reflect on the trends that we are seeing in this region, Caribbean specifically. So Keisha, over to you first. The Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator specifically focuses on improving the resilience of small island developing states. Can you share with us more of CCSA's strategy for and work in this region?
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having us. I think I'll just give a very brief backdrop because persons are still not very familiar with us. We are a fairly new organization We were announced at President Macron's One Planet Summit in 2018. And we were led by Prime Ministers Skerrit of Dominica, Mitchell of Grenada, Castanet of St. Lucia, and Virgin Group founder Sir Richard Branson, alongside other key regional actors, the IDB, namely the IDB and the World Bank. And our organization was designed specifically to bring new opportunities via partnerships and funding to the region from philanthropy and the private sector, working alongside the existing actors in the region and in partnership with those actors. So our work is focused on three core areas. We have lighthouse and pipeline projects where we're identifying and accelerating impactful projects and implementing them, but also scaling projects. And we do this primarily through matchmaking the region with various sources of, and this is a very key term for us, fit for purpose funding. As access to that type of funding is, the funding that actually fills the gaps and the needs is one of the region's primary barriers to climate action execution. There is funding available, but does the funding meet the region where it's at? And that's very critical, one of the critical challenges that we're seeing in the region. Secondly, we also support matchmaking in terms of technical leadership and other resources, such as innovative technology solutions that we think could significantly make a difference in the region's ability to achieve its climate objectives. We do a lot of relationship building, so another core aspect of our work, so bridging that gap between governments, private sector, implementation and funding. We have found that the two sectors speak different languages. And I think this is probably the case across the world, right? But we're all, it's a case of 6 and half a dozen. We're all actually trying to get to the same point. And how could we bridge that gap between these two sectors to have them work more cohesively towards that common goal? Advocacy is absolutely important for us too as well. So amplifying the opportunities and the progress that the Caribbean has made internationally. We are not only a region characterized by challenges, but we're also a very resilient region. And we've been able to prove that, and being able to put that on the world stage is very important for us. But also being able to strategically look at how we can support the region's objectives, not only just the Caribbean, but alongside other small island developing states, and working together to achieve our objectives. We work across 4 pillars. And so for us, the Climate Smart Map, which we actually just recently launched the 0.20 version at CREF in Miami a couple of weeks ago. This is an interactive map that serves philanthropists, investors, governments, entrepreneurs, civil society to support project funding, development, and advocacy. And so the underlying data of that roadmap helps to identify things like costs, the implications for timelines, and what we need to do in order to achieve our goal of becoming a climate smart region. We also focus on renewable energy, so 90% renewable energy by 2035. Our third pillar is protecting 30% of our land and oceans by 2030. And so how could we support the region for that commitment to protect 30% of land and ocean by 2030? And how we can do that through focusing on innovative financing mechanisms, climate smart agriculture practices, and the development of a sustainable blue economy. And then the fourth pillar is 1.5% new green jobs, which is to strengthen the regional's economic resilience against exogenous shocks by building climate action as an economic industry. And so really seeing climate as an opportunity for economic growth in the region.
Thanks so much, Keisha. Yeah, a lot of different pillars of work and areas of focus. So great to see that divergence. Donna, over to you now. The Kellogg Foundation has a long history of impact towards children and families in the U.S., and as of a decade ago to Haiti as well. Please, can you tell us more about your work with Kellogg and how WPKF came to be working in the Caribbean?
Thank you, Sneha. Again, such a pleasure to be here for this very fitting conversation. As I was reflecting in preparation for today, it dawned on me, in fact, that we started our engagement in the Caribbean region in the 40s, about a decade after the founding of the Kellogg Foundation. Our work at the time was focused primarily around fellowship, and particularly around health. And over time, it grew to include agriculture, food system, and increasingly rural development across a number of countries within the Caribbean region and Latin America, including West Africa, over time. But particularly around the 1990s, and many of you may remember, and I'm also of Haitian ancestry, grew up in Haiti, so many may remember around the 1990s that the region went through deep economic restructuring of a number of sorts, with particularly impacting fiscal policies, monetary policies, trade liberalization, and that led to a deepening of crisis around economic development, stagnation in some ways. And this was one of the impetus for the foundation to deepen and rethink about how it was engaging. Prior to the 1990s, our engagement was more thematic as opposed to place focused. And we started changing to really thinking to ourselves, how is the foundation and the foundation who fundamentally in our 90 years of existence exists to support conditions for children and family to thrive? How does a foundation like ours position itself to align and partner with communities in a deeper way? So the lessons from the early days, such as the importance of local leadership, the importance of infrastructure development, supporting and strengthening civil society, impacted how we saw our work in the 90s. And we slowly started to do more work around what we're calling our three main pillars: education, health, and broadly speaking, economic development. And we also call it sometimes family economic security, because we do anchor the focus on the family and the household as the unit of quote unquote impact on, and that guides us on whether we know we're being impactful and effective or not. So we shifted our approach to focusing on local capacity building and systemic understanding that the root cause of the challenges that we're seeing across the Caribbean, across the world, but particularly across the Caribbean region, pertain to a shared legacy in the region of colonization and slavery that has impacted deeply systems of inequity, whether we're looking at education systems, economic systems, and health systems. So we needed to position ourselves to be the kind of partner that could be in a place for a very long time, which we have since defined as being a generation. And we needed to adopt what we're calling a full portfolio activation to responding to the needs in a way that is intentional and in a way that is supporting local leadership and local solutioning. So we reaffirmed our commitment at the time to be able to do that approach. We realized that we couldn't be in as many countries as we were. So we reaffirmed our commitment through a place-based strategy that we launched in 2007, 2010. And that's when we deepened our work in Haiti, where I have the deep honor of leading our work around economic development. And we also have colleagues and partners around health and education. But ultimately, the focus of our work, similarly to the US, but in Haiti, in Mexico is our other place, is really looking at where and how do we support individuals, institutions, systems, policy. Where do we show up as conveners, recognizing that all these three layers of impact are required to see tangible transformation across our work. So within economic development in particular, that similar approach means that we're working very intentionally with entrepreneurs and producers. We're working across with institutions that are supporting entrepreneurs and producers across the board, whether they're capital providers, technical assistants, market creators, as well. And we're also intentional around where do we support policy and linkages across the ecosystems so that we can talk about sustainable economic development over the long term in alignment with climate consideration, particularly for a region of the Caribbean, the SDGs and other priorities. And that's where for us, really the full unlocking of our portfolio across grant making and blended structuring has been pivotal, and providing the kind of continuum of capital that is required for communities to advance economically in a way that is both in alignment with priorities, but tangible.
Wonderful. Thank you, Donna. A common theme I'm seeing with CCSA and Kellogg is both needing to do the work, but also build this advocacy, environment, enablement component as well. So interesting to see that start to emerge. Next, I'd love to hand over to you, Shanique. You started your career working with the TNC in the Bahamas for a decade, and then you're now transitioned into a regional role. Can you tell us more about TNC and your work in this region?
Sure, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here to share more about TNC and our work in the region, and just similar to others, just sharing a little bit about TNC, or the Nature Conservancy. If you're not familiar with us, the Nature Conservancy is an international and nonprofit conservation organization. We've been around for about 70 years. It was started actually in the state of New York in the US, but has grown to a global organization. We work throughout the entire US, Canada, and in about 72 countries around the world, and that includes the Caribbean. And we have a Caribbean division, which I'm the deputy director of. And TNC actually started working in the Caribbean more than 40 years ago. So we kind of a deep history in the region. And similar to our larger parent organization, the work in the region started with looking at land acquisition of areas of unique and important biodiversity, so that they can be managed in perpetuity as protected areas, right, to preserve that biodiversity. But over time, understanding and recognizing that the challenges we're facing in the environmental space, both in the region and globally, are really complex. They're evolving. They go well beyond trying to address in situ conservation. TNC has evolved, and now our portfolio of work in the region spans ocean protection, climate adaptation and resilience, looking at coral conservation, and beyond. So it still has a biodiversity focus, but we're looking at that biodiversity and how that can support the well-being of the small island developing states in the Caribbean, and the welfare of the people of this region. And doing that involves multiple avenues. We really believe in sound science, using science to guide our conservation work and our interventions. But hand in hand with that, as has already been said, policy is key. You do need grounding for your work in the policy framework of a country or a region or an organization, whatever scale you're working at. And hand in hand with that, we do believe that we should be supporting the empowerment and the rights of the people in the Caribbean to actually design and lead their own future. And so we believe strongly in capacity building as well as a part of our conservation tools that we use to support the region. At the moment, we work either directly or through partnerships and other forms of engagement in 17 countries and/or territories. I mentioned territories because we do work in the USVI and Puerto Rico, which are territories of the US. And but we have staff in 5 places in the country and the Caribbean directly. So we have staff where I am in the Bahamas. I'm also in Jamaica, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Dominican Republic. We also have staff based in Grenada who cover the Eastern Caribbean for us and our portfolio. So at the moment, the 3 big pillars of work for us is transforming ocean management, climate resilience for people and nature, and then the large-scale coral conservation, as I mentioned. So thinking about what are we looking at in terms of our work on ocean management, this strategy really emphasizes both protecting in terms of like marine protected areas and other spaces, other area-based conservation in the region, but also broader management of our ocean spaces, and that includes sustainable fisheries, which is a critical form of economic development for many in the Caribbean, but also supports, well-being of people in terms of a source of food and protein from the ocean. And we're also looking at how can our ocean management and protection work support coastal adaptation. Climate change is a major issue for every country in our region, and it's cross-cutting. It has impacts in the environment, in education, health. And so addressing climate change as we advance the work that we're doing is critical, I think, to us, but also to support the countries around the region as they themselves are grappling with this kind of ongoing challenge. So this work around ocean protection includes things like we've supported through the Caribbean Challenge Initiative, the creation of new protected areas in many places throughout the region, sustainable financing to support the management of those protected areas, More recently, we've done things like nature bonds that focuses on restructuring of sovereign debt for countries in the region, but they're using that as a means to an end to support ocean conservation and management. Our large-scale kind of coral solutions really aims to accelerate coral recovery across the region, where we see there's been significant decline of coral reefs for many, many reasons: overfishing, direct damage from poor habits and practices, and more recently, climate change and things like increasing temperatures in the ocean and whatnot are severely impacting the reefs. And so the work that we're doing in the region is across at least 8 countries and territories, including Puerto Rico and USVI. And this work impacts about 90% of the corals in the region. And we're hoping that we can support their, the reversing the decline of coral, and in fact, seeing corals continuing to thrive in the region. We have coral innovation hubs in the USVI, the Dominican Republic, and the Bahamas, which are really centers of excellence for looking at new and innovative techniques for rearing coral, accelerating their growth, finding efficiencies in terms of the cost of doing this work. But it's also looking at how can this help with the challenges that corals are being faced with climate. So using some of our science, we've identified what we are terming coral refugia around the region. And these are sites that we think, based on data we've collected and other factors, are positioned to withstand the impacts of climate change in the region, and hopefully will be around for decades to come to continue to support our communities and the people of the region. And then last but not least, we do have a focus specifically on climate resilience, using nature-based solutions to help communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. This focuses on building safer communities, using coastal ecosystems. It also focuses on securing livelihoods through resilient food and water systems in the region. And we're also doing financing mechanisms through this work. For example, in Dominican Republic, we are working on things like water funds, which is helping to engage the private sector, bring in financing from multiple sources to support the management of watersheds, restoration, in some cases, etc., all with the aim of supporting, water security and addressing challenges related to climate change. So, that's not everything we're doing, but you could see from what I've shared, we have a kind of comprehensive and multifaceted approach to our work in the region. And we're trying to address the urgent needs of both the people and the environment in the Caribbean. And we feel like, we have a lot to bring to the table as we think about how can we use blended finance to support conservation in the Caribbean and in SIDS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks so much, Shanique. Also, yes, a very, very long history of TNC with blended finance and this type of work. But speaking of a multifaceted approach, lastly, over to you, Eduardo. Would love to hear. So, Platform for Social Impact has really been dedicated to the recovery of Puerto Rico, which occupies a unique space sort of in the Caribbean. So, can you please tell us about your work with PSI and PSI's perspective on this region?
Saludos, everybody. So I'm going to start with purpose. The work that we do in Puerto Rico really is anchored on creating opportunities, economic opportunities for low-income people, especially because in Puerto Rico, 6 out of 10 children live under poverty. So we approach the work, first of all, from that lens. What is the outcome, the ultimate outcome that we want to see? And to get to the work that we're doing right now, there is a few realizations that I think that we all share. At one point, you have to realize that we are small enough to think about scale. And that is significant because most of the projects that we see around low-income communities are just small in nature and usually not designed with the intentionality of achieving scale. And for us, that was 2 years ago, really a realization that the conversation always in small islands needs to be around scalability and scale. And when we think about scale in a setting like Puerto Rico and some of the islands that we are talking about today, the reality is that that becomes public policy. The work of investment, the work of making sure that we are identifying solutions really become and should become public policy. And for us, I mentioned that because that purpose for us is to drive economic opportunities for families, needs to be guarded from unintended consequences. We have all seen the results in the Caribbean of initiatives that some were intentional. Let's say that a lot were intentional, but that exercise of identifying the players, identifying the outcomes that we wanted to see for people, usually has been missing. And what we do at the Platform for Social Impact, first of all, is to identify and highlight with research what is the problem that we want to solve. And in this case, is providing pathways for economic mobility. We partner with public sector, private sector, and community organizations to highlight possible solutions. And then we go about identifying projects that are showing potential for solutions, and we matchmaking them with capital. So the reality is that we become, in one hand, a group that is highlighting framework and pathways, but on the other hand, we're really doing matchmaking between capital and community solutions that, like you mentioned before, some of these groups, they don't speak to each other. We don't go to the same places, and that bridge is very necessary. So part of the work is, one, making sure that people are in the same rooms, and part of our work is to connect through a variety of ways, highlighting the work of community groups, but also highlighting the intentionality of capital to come in our region. And part of it is really being intentional on having the conversation around outcomes early on the process, and we facilitate some of those discussions. Today we have a mixed portfolio that goes from a real estate project that we are about to close in San Juan. We also manage a small business portfolio of about 7 deals inside that portfolio.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eduardo. So I can see that the Caribbean definitely has a whole host of challenges that everyone's working on in different ways. So I've got climate, renewable energy, protecting land, protecting oceans, biodiversity, climate resilience. That goes on and on. I have 2 pages of notes just from our introductions here. But blended finance, the idea of blended finance is using that very scarce catalytic capital to mobilize private sector investment, mobilize additional capital into really specific places. Convergence always, our core message at Convergence is blended finance is not a magic a spell. It's not a silver bullet. It cannot be applied and should not be applied everywhere. So I'd love to hear all of your experiences on actually engaging with the private sector and mobilizing capital to the causes that you're working on. So Keisha, I'll turn over to you first. You mentioned CCSA has been pioneering blended finance through your project, the investor forum, a whole range of activities. What have been your key activities and learnings for mobilizing capital specifically for SIDS?
Thank you. I think, just kind of stepping back and looking how the region has been traditionally characterized. We've been a region that has been traditionally characterized by grant funding. People understand grant funding. People understand how to develop projects for grant funding. But now that we're moving into different types of funding sources and we're tapping more into philanthropy and the private sector and the blended finance space, we're seeing the need for design and preparation funds. That type of catalytic grant funding that is used for the design and preparation of transactions to improve the viability and the bankability of projects, but also to help enterprises to reach financial close. Eduardo actually made a really salient point about the development of projects from the outset with scaling as the intention. I also think that is a new way of developing projects that is becoming more and more necessary in the region. And when you think about the general size of individual countries in our region, you're not only just talking about scaling within countries, but you're also talking about scaling regionally to make enterprises financially viable and what that looks like. And it does take a different set of project preparation and a different set of resources than what the region is accustomed to design these types of projects. These design stage for grants are particularly useful when you're talking about supporting proof of concept, establishing baseline and monitoring and verification systems, when you're talking about developing a pipeline and providing that pre-commercial funding that's needed in the initial stages of an investment thesis or vehicle. And then, of course, these instruments could also include convertible grants, including right of first refusal for investors. So for us, some of the key insights is being able to use blended finance in this way to provide those resources to carry out that economic analysis that's often needed in order to make sure that the model, it actually works. But also that it also engages a very diverse range of stakeholders. So the public sector, the private sector, civil society, and how do you maximize that stakeholder buy-in? And so all of that needs to be considered in how the model is designed, but that also determines the chances of success. And then when you look at that across sectors now, you realize that some sectors need more help than others. So for example, those design stage grants, they really play an important role in nature-based related transactions. And when for us, when I'm talking about nature-based transactions, I'm also talking about climate smart and regenerative agriculture. And when you look at the transactions that have happened in the region and that are currently being catalyzed, it's more focused on blue economy, which is amazing and completely necessary, but also our food security needs to be a focus. And so how do we focus on using blended finance to fund climate smart agriculture, to fund regenerative agriculture? And these projects, they benefit a lot from this type of funding, particularly in the discovery stage, right? And the solutions are generally less developed and so require more baseline data systems to track that impact. The business models might require proof of concept. The investment structures may need to be developed and proven. One of the good examples of this for us is the development of the Caribbean Sustainable Energy Fund, which we call CSEF. And this fund is an opportunity to address the systemic issues impeding the transition to resilient and sustainable energy in the Caribbean. This fund was born out of the Island Resilience Action Challenge. So we would have worked with a task force since 2019 to create the concept for this instrument that would provide low-cost, accessible financing for renewable energy projects in the region. And following that initial landscape analysis that was undertaken by members of the task force, which were individuals from across different agencies throughout the region, we were able to mobilize a consultancy funded by the Caribbean Development Bank through funding from the Government of Canada to support this phase, this crucial development phase, to the tune of $250,000 US dollars. And what this grant enabled us to do was the procurement of a consultant, and the consultant then went to work on validating the task force's concept, providing recommendations for the design, the structure, the eventual home of the blended finance instrument, and also creating a roadmap for the design and establishment of the fund. And so for us, the objectives of the fund is to catalyze that investment and entrepreneurship in sustainable energy enterprises and projects in the Caribbean, to improve energy security and resilience in the electricity sector, to promote ESG objectives in the energy sector, the environment, climate change, social inclusion, gender equality, good governance, so including all of the cross-cutting themes, but also to help reduce energy costs. As we move into the other stage now, where we're developing the framework for the fund management, identifying the seed investors, identifying the anchor investors and other concessional investors to secure the seed investor interests, we see that these funds could be layered to distribute risk and returns differently. to commercial and concessional investors. And here, the concessional finance can play a key role to mobilize commercial capital, where debt and equity at below market rates will help to lower the overall cost of capital and mobilize finance from more risk-averse investors. So this was just one, and we're at the starting stage, but it's moving along really well. And we have been able to mobilize the buying of different actors from across the region. But we definitely see here blended finance playing a key role in bringing this fund to reality.
And great to see the progress all this time. But speaking of the journey in the Caribbean from philanthropic to more different ways of capital, Donna, what brought about Kellogg's interest in blended finance and mobilizing capital compared to the previously mentioned traditional philanthropy?
Thank you, Sneha. I think it's so great to go after Keisha because so much of what she's talking about is exactly the point. As I've mentioned, for us, the North Star is where do we see tangible transformation in economic and environmental conditions for the places where we work, right? So in this case, in Haiti, in the broader Caribbean region, the importance of not looking at just thematic pieces, but understanding that for communities to be to get to sustainable development, it means that food system considerations have to advance in tandem with climate considerations, in tandem with entrepreneurship consideration, in tandem with the host of other issues. So for us, on one end, it's really this two-headed approach. On one end, using our grant funding to de-risk at two levels, right? So when we talk about de-risking, investing and people, investing in institutions, investing in infrastructure, investing in the policies around capital provision and access. And I'm not sure if it's today that Keisha mentioned it, but to reference a comment that she's made before, what we've seen over the years is not that funding is not available. The funding that is available and the mechanisms that are available are ill-equipped for the context, for the organizations, and for the stages. So understanding that, we intentionally position ourselves to quote unquote de-risk and providing what is necessary for the entrepreneurs, what is necessary for the technical assistance providers, but then what is necessary to make blended finance possible, right? So as that first loss, we've played a role of providing guarantees, first loss being that first tranche, and convening the players and the actors to advance in that way. So for us, it's really looking at, we all have heard about the missing middle financing gap, but we're talking about even before that, right? What is needed so that the startups, and it's essentially everything that Keisha described, what is needed and what is the role that philanthropy and grant making can play to allow the startup in mass. So when we're talking about scale, there's a notion of scale in one giving particular initiative or one giving project, but there's also the notion of scale in terms of what is the opportunity to advance a particular sector and advance entrepreneurs in mass, right? Because we recognize that entrepreneurship is the engine for sustainable economic development. So how do we create the conditions that allows entrepreneurs to move and to progress in mass over time? So we're talking about pre-missing middle and organizing our resources to allow that continuum of capital to start even early on, but with the intentionality that we know we do need to get to the kind of structures like blended finance so that the ecosystem can have access to the resources needed. The second piece that I would mention that we think about beyond just kind of traditional grant making is really using our influence as a convener, right? So convening not just around policy, but convening other funders, convening in a way that we can together as funders consider ourselves as the funding ecosystem so that we're intentional. Different funders, and you've met one foundation, right? So philanthropy is is not a monolith in terms of what it is and the kind of tools that it offers and the kind of flexibility that different providers can have depending on how they're structured. So how can we convene intentionally a diverse grouping of capital providers so that we can provide what is needed at the right time using different resources and different tools, and do so to minimize the burden on accelerators, incubators, and entrepreneurs to do all that legwork that's oftentimes very expensive to be able to reach this kind of capital. So taking on that cost as philanthropy, I think is something that we find very important. Taking on the cost, but then bringing folks together in a way that allows those blended structures to be unleashed. And the other side of this too is also spending resources, particularly in new kind of financial products. As an example, Keisha talked about food insecurity, right? Agriculture is quote unquote in our region, particularly given the impact of climate incidents and climate events and the frequency of climate events. Agriculture is quote unquote a very risky endeavor. So what is the role of philanthropy in investing in the kind of mechanism and tools and structures that take that risk off of the market, and where philanthropy can absorb that risk and allow more transactions to happen because we're funding the kind of tools and resources that allow that, that makes it possible. And the last piece that I would mention as well in terms of to name a couple of examples of what that has looked like in our work. On one end, as a foundation, we launched a social bond at this point, I think 4 years ago. And some of the resources from that social bond, and the social bond was across the SDGs, committed across the SDGs, across our work, and really using our corpus in a way that allows us to move in innovative ways. And one of the results of that was seeding the fund, the Impact First Fund, with global partnerships that, through the leveraging of Senior and other OPIC and others, were able to be the catalytic partner that allowed the Impact First Fund to be launched. And that fund is now, I think, 3 years old and doing quite well. And while we were doing this in parallel, supporting, as I described earlier, the actors around food systems. So there's a large systems change initiative in Haiti that has launched, is the Haiti Food System Alliance, working with 40,000 farmers and addressing both long-term regenerative agriculture, agroecology, and using kind of climate smart practices to support the transition of smallholder farmers, but also addressing immediate needs, addressing humanitarian need through local production, as opposed to food imports, which we know is completely devastating to the economy. So this fund that I've mentioned on one end that was launched with global partnership has then since come back and was able to make a loan through First Laws that we also provided to the Haiti Food System Alliance to, in fact, support not just that track, right, exactly. So it's connecting the dot 3 years down the line, but then the beauty of it is that having done that, so de-risking on the side of the ecosystem, so agriculture is now more attractive because there's a host of players around it at the system level. And then on the other side, the fund was intentionally designed to do this kind of work. So now it's attracting, and we also launched the Pockets of Hope campaign, which is a $90 million campaign for Haiti, and where we pledged 30 million. And part of that is attracting other funders to come in and play the role that they can around with blended structures now that we've done this work, right? That we've de-risked across levels. The last thing that I'll say, I'm quite excited about this conversation because I think, again, the more that we talk and the more that I'm hearing from Keisha and Shanique, again, the challenges are, the patterns are the same. And as I was getting ready for this conversation today, thinking about where the Caribbean as a region was in the 1990s, it struck me that a lot of the issues in the 1990s that were top issues are the same issues that we're talking about today. So I know we're not at the call of action time of the conversation, but I think really looking at what it is that we can, how much we can unleash our resources, giving who we are as different kinds of institutions, including philanthropy, and the key role that philanthropy can play as a glue in the ecosystem. I would urge us to think about that because hopefully in the next 10 years, we can talk about different set of issues for the Caribbean and not the same.
Yes, indeed. And something I picked up on that we rarely hear is we always hear about the challenges of scale, but there is an advantage in in smaller scale and smaller countries, because you can really be a market mover, a market shaper with your work much more easily than, in these bigger countries. So Shanique, over to you. I know, so TNC has established several trust funds around the region via the Caribbean Challenge Initiative and most recently via the Barbados Natural Nature Bond Project. Can you tell us more about these initiatives and TNC's engagement with the private sector?
Sure. And, just similar to others, how did TNC get into the space of blended finance, starting out as a conservation organization, really focus on biodiversity protection and sustainable management. It's similar to what Keisha mentioned. For us and many of the actors in the space where we are, which is in the environmental conservation space, traditionally, the sources of funding have always been through gifts and grants. And this is good, but it also is not sustainable. You're dealing with a gift that maybe is a one-off or two-time gift, and then after that, you're scrambling to find more funding. And usually those sources of funding are relatively small in terms of scale. And so what some of our learnings for TNC working in the Caribbean, but also around the world, was like, if we really want to keep up with the challenges that we're trying to address and having the impact we want to have and the sustainability of the work beyond like a project cycle or a one-time kind of funding cycle, we have to find more innovative ways of funding the work. So this is what was kind of leading TNC in the space of innovation around how can we be more creative about getting funding, sustainable sources of funding, as well as larger scale funding to support the conservation work that we're doing in the many places we're working in the region and around the world. And so blended finance is a part of that mix. And you mentioned the conservation trust funds and the nature bond. So just two projects we've worked on in the Caribbean under the Caribbean Challenge Initiative that TNC and many others supported starting in 2008, going into 2020. We looked at how can we get sustainable financing for the management of protected areas to address a key challenge, which is we've had a lot of protected areas created, but they're not being actively managed or effectively managed because of the shortfall and gap in funding, and trying to close that gap in a sustainable way. So the trust funds are really like institutional arrangements that are really hoping to crowdsource, for lack of a better term, funding that can come from public sources, private sources, corporate sources, whatever sources that can then be used to generate revenue for funding conservation in the long term. So that's basically the gist of that. And through that work, we've created the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, or not created, but supported the creation of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, the CBF, which is a regional conservation trust fund. And we've also worked with numerous countries in the region to create about 10 national level conservation trust funds that are focused specifically on an individual country. For example, like the Bahamas, we've worked to create and support the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund and et cetera around the region. How has it gone with the corporate sector, engaging them in this particular piece of work? I would say it's been a journey of learning and growth for us as well as for the corporate sector. As Keisha was mentioning, these things are new. Conservation trust funds were new for the Caribbean with the creation of the CBF in 2012, so just a decade ago. That perhaps is one of the first ones in the region. And then we've now worked to fill in those other ones I mentioned at the national scale in the last 10 years. So this is a really new concept. So understanding what is the mechanism where the funding can be directed and how does it actually bring positive impact into the world is one that takes a while for the corporate sector to engage in. We're also in the landscape of the corporate sector, particularly in the Caribbean, is not used to mechanisms of blended finance. So there's a learning curve around the financial components and the kind of modalities that would channel private sector funding into blended finance, particularly for conservation in a meaningful way. That has been a learning journey. So I would say we've made efforts, but I definitely think it's still a room to grow. We were able to engage private sector. For example, we had the private sector signing on to a corporate compact with the CCI in 2013. Some of the trust funds have directly engaged like the local businesses in their countries. For example, the St. Lucia National Conservation Trust Fund has a partnership with Massey, which is a chain of food stores in St. Lucia, who supports them. But making that transition from philanthropic giving, which is what a lot of the corporate sector knows, to using their funding and leveraging it in other ways around revenue generation and blended finance is still, I think, an area of growth and something we continue to work on in the region. With the Nature Bonds program that the Nature Conservancy has had, and we've been able to successfully do a nature bond both in Barbados as well as in Belize. If you're thinking about the wider Caribbean, not just the insular Caribbean, this is really a finance mechanism that's targeting sovereign debt and restructuring sovereign debt as a catalyst to get funding for conservation for the long-term management of areas. And in the Barbados example of our blue bonds, the IDB and TNC provided guarantees. That was really a de-risking mechanism to make the investment of the private sector a little bit more attractive, and to help with really selling the blue bonds or the nature bonds programs to the private sector. So we've seen success with those two countries in the region. That, of course, as you mentioned earlier, not all forms of private blended finance is for everybody. So that is very specific, looking at sovereign debt, and it's only possible under a certain set of circumstances. But we continue to explore that in the region and see if there's other opportunities to do that. And TNC is also exploring something called PFPs, Project Finance for Permanence, which is more like a suite of financial mechanisms, including blended finance, that can try to fill the entire gap for a particular focus. For us, biodiversity conservation for a country. It can include a nature bond, but it can also include other forms of blended finance mechanisms. So we're also looking like how can we have the portfolio of projects that can really address the scale of funding that's needed for the region. And the last, I guess, thing we're working on in terms of, well, not last, but another example I want to share about blended finance for us in the space of environmental conservation is a project that's being led by the Nature Conservancy in the Bahamas, where I'm based. It's called Bahama Reefs. And this project is actually a project that's a program of the Global Fund for Coral Reef. The Global Fund for Coral Reef is a new fund that was started around 2020, so relatively new. But the entire premise of the Global Fund for Coral Reef is basically, it's a blended finance approach that includes both grants and investment funding, right? The grant funds can help incubate a pipeline of investable projects. And for Bahama Reefs in the Bahamas, we're targeting local community scale businesses that have a kind of business model or revenue generation model that we see as being reef positive or nature positive. So either through the business model, it's somehow protecting a reef or some marine ecosystem, or reducing a threat to ecosystem, or providing some solution. So like one example of a project we have with a group called the Elizabeth Harbor Partnership in Exuma in the Bahamas is they're working on deploying moorings in an area that's really popular for boating in the Bahamas, in an area where there's no moorings. And we're seeing damage to seagrasses and reefs because of boat anchor damage and other things. The moorings are going to be installed to address that and hopefully relieve that challenge and pressure on the natural ecosystems, but also through the rental of the moorings, it's giving funding that can then go back into management of the ecosystem, support the local businesses that are going to be doing this. But we're using that as an opportunity to crowd in funding from investors who want to see this happen. And we're looking at some forms of smaller waste management solutions, etc., as well in Exuma. So just examples of this. So this kind of form of funding, as it was mentioned, is quite challenging. People are very uncomfortable with things like talking about repayable grants, concessional loans, equity financing. These are things that have been around in various iterations in the Caribbean, but have been mostly deployed in other sectors. They've not been deployed in the environmental sector. So for people who've traditionally funded their work through just grants, you get a gift. You basically report back on the gift in a kind of narrative and perhaps maybe some M&E way, but not necessarily that level of going to, there's this extra risks and accountability around making sure the funding is generating revenue and using that revenue generation to perhaps repay those funds so they can be deployed again. Getting that idea socialized is a key challenge. The other challenge we are seeing as we work with Bahama Reefs is just the scale, as been mentioned before. Lots of people want big ticket items, and we have very small local level businesses that need, in some ways, but some people might consider it microfinancing or smaller levels of funding. They're needing $200,000 and $300,000. They're not needing $5 million or $10 million. So getting that scaling of the funding and still making sure it's viable is something we're learning as we go with the Bahama Reefs program in Bahamas.
Thanks so much, Shanique. It sounds like TNC really has a lot of ways to engage depending on, what your investment interests are, instruments are, mandates are. So that's great to hear. Eduardo, over to you for PSI's blended finance work. I know you had a very important summit last month on this topic as well. And then I'll leave. I know we're close to the end, but over to you, Eduardo, and then maybe we can take the last minute, a lightning round for our call to action and wrap up. So Eduardo.
Thank you. So I'm going to stay with the themes. I think that in the Caribbean, we're either recovering or preparing for the next climate catastrophe. So I think that that's for us to embrace and really think about how we make the most opportunity for people on this issue. And that's what we have done in Puerto Rico. As many of you know, 6 years ago, we went through one of those catastrophic 1 in 100 year storm that really reshaped part of the country, but at the same time awarded a set of resources that were not there in the previous 30 years for reconstruction and rebuild. And I think if anything, I think we need to think about infrastructure in a different way, because we are all doing some sort of infrastructure work for our governments. Traditionally, infrastructure is about bridges and roads, and we have been very intentional on positioning the human capital infrastructure, how we want to invest and build up that infrastructure of humans. And for that, in Puerto Rico, we have a concrete project. It's called Oasis. It's a mixed use development that we will be closing at the end of this month. It's a $43 million blended finance project that would include a brand new K-12 public school, a health clinic, and a business development center right across from the airport in San Juan. And that project basically came from the realization that a lot of the low-income neighborhoods in Puerto Rico and the islands are deserts for opportunity. And more families need to be able to have one-stop shops where they can really support the growth of all the members of the family. But putting together this structure required that we kind of left the island to talk to people that were willing to partner. These transaction includes 7 lending institutions, 4 nonprofits, and 3 government agencies. So if anything, I wanted to share in the last minute a little bit of the learnings, and because I think there's commonality across all the projects. Doesn't matter what it is, it's going to feel for a lot of people that this is the first time, or it's going to be a pilot. Anything that we do in the Caribbean, people are going to receive it that way. And I think that we need to understand that since the beginning, because that's something that we need to understand how we're going to approach it. Second, because some of these projects indeed are first timers, we cannot underestimate what we don't know. And capital usually wins to unblock roadblocks. So I think that we need to start thinking about how we actually present projects in a way that we are not thinking of the less amount of resources that are necessary versus the necessary resources that are indeed necessary to move these projects. I think that we can underestimate the work that we have to do with the sponsor team. These projects are not short-term in nature. Sometimes they take years to put together, and fatigue and change of leadership can play a role. So having that muscle of going back, re-engaging leadership is very important, and seeking public and community support early is going to be super important, because some of these projects are going to hit snags, and it's only that community support and public support that is actually going to allow to keep people on the table. The last thing I want to say on some of those learnings is that yes, there's complexity and some technical work and technical language around these deals. We should not worry as much of that, and we should put a lot more attention to leadership change, because at the end of the day, it's going to be leaders that are going to either change their investment portfolio rules, that are going to say yes to the region, and those are leadership decisions. They're not structuring decisions. So we have to be more intentional about how we approach leadership and talk to their risk mitigation alarms that are going out every time somebody say Caribbean. We need to be more proactive on solving for those bells and whistles. And lastly, I'm going to say that as beautiful as the Caribbean is, it's going to require both us engaging with the world and the world engaging with us. So when Sneha mentioned what we did last month by creating an impact summit, basically is that bringing different people from around the world that can bring resources, capital, engaging them with the work in the island. I think that is super necessary. And at the same time, we need to take the Caribbean on the roadshow and also engaging with others, sharing our best practices, and but also sharing the opportunity for investments in the Caribbean.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. I know we're at time, so thank you everyone for continuing to stay on. Let's just do a lightning round to wrap up, maybe a call of action or concluding words with everyone. So Keisha, over to you, just very, very, very briefly.
I feel like the panel really hits like all the salient points, and it just kind of reinforced that the challenges that we experience are not unique, and that in having these spaces to be able to discuss those challenges, we can come together or convene around what the solutions are. Definitely, the risk that goes along with our size. In the case of blended finance, the size does matter in terms of access to finance. And Dana really hit the head, Dana really hit the head on in terms of the role of foundation and philanthropies in terms of being able to educate investors and building buy-in among the different actors, whether that's public or private sector investors. But also as a convener. So, by participating in philanthropy collectives, new actors to this space, who are at that early stage, of the learning curve. Because it's not only just the Caribbean that's at the early learning stage, but also the investors, the philanthropists, the foundations, they are also learning how to interact with this new market too as well. And so that learning is taking place on both sides, and having access to spaces where that can happen, and those types of convenings is very, really critical. Eduardo mentioned in terms of, it's the same set of actors that we see in the space. When you look at the list of blended finance work that's happening, not only just in the region, but around the world, it's some of the same multilateral development banks, the same philanthropic organizations, foundations. And so how do we bring other people into the space? How do we bring in the credit unions? How do we bring in the pension funds? And how do we design funds that are best suited for the type of financing that they would be looking for? So how do we design the types of products and mechanisms that will fit into their portfolio, particularly because, their portfolio is actually very well suited to nature-based solutions and climate-smart agriculture, food security options because of the long-term nature of their financing. I would also say in terms of that clearer type of communication in terms of the positive investment performance of instruments, and people having more transparency on the impact and what they have accomplished and what they can accomplish in the future, so that all the actors within the space understand how that works. And then the last thing that I think we don't necessarily tap into enough is government donor funds. So while a lot of governments, depending on the mandate that the government has, it may or may not allow them to use taxpayers' funds to be part of a commercial investment vehicle, in most cases, government donor agencies could actually fund technical assistance grants and technical assistance facilities that allow that capacity that Shanique was talking about to be built in the local institutions, whether that's for education aspect for private sector or for local civil society organizations to be able to carry out projects under the blended finance vehicle. And that's a really key role that government can play outside, of course, of creating the enabling environment. Shanika had also mentioned in terms of, or alluded to the fact that not all funds fit all environments. And so even just, who owns the debt is sometimes problematic when you look at the country's debt profile and whether certain types of bonds are actually viable. So understanding that not because something was a great solution in one space, that when you kind of look under the hood, that it may require a more innovative or a different solution based on the debt profile of a country, for example, with bonds. I would leave the rest for the rest of my amazing panel to comment on.
Thank you, Keisha. Donna.
I second Keisha. I mean, so many gems. I'll probably emphasize, I think, some of the pieces that maybe I think just adding to the conversation. I've mentioned before this notion of whole portfolio approaches, right? Again, incentivizing philanthropy. I do think that also philanthropy has an opportunity to support and strengthening and particularly in the Caribbean, right? What is the opportunity for Caribbean philanthropists to be organized, to be connected, to intentionally play a certain position, right? Within the capital stack. So I think the piece around what doesn't philanthropy look like within the Caribbean and looking at all the tools and resources that as philanthropy we most have access to intentionally unlock and unleash those strategic tools. The second piece connected to that is, again, really intentionally seeding next-gen climate risk financing, whether it's disaster insurance, whether it's hedging instruments. Again, we know that those are critical for us in the Caribbean, given the frequency of climate events and the fact that this is a risk that I think, to Eduardo's point, that we do need to embrace because there's no way around it. So what are the hedging instruments that we as philanthropy can and should invest in to make them more available and more accessible so that they can play this key role and making blended finance, blended structures accessible. The other piece, again, I think Eduardo's comment around influencing narratives and this notion of roadshow, it's something that we are experimenting with as the Cal Foundation around the campaign that I've mentioned in Haiti. So happy to share more offline about what that looks like. And for us, so far it's meant intentional conference conversation and conversation in spaces where typical entrepreneurs and other actors won't have access to. So we use our access in those places to have conversations that may be kind of newer conversations. So definitely this notion of really broadening the ecosystem of actors who can and should engage with us in the Caribbean, I think is definitely strategic and timely. The other piece related to that is, again, really the convening piece, but the piece that I would add to that, and I was just thinking about this. So I have the deep honor of chairing the board of the Haiti Biodiversity Fund, which is one of the conservation funds that Shanique was just talking about, that the TNC has been instrumental about, with Caribbean Biodiversity Fund being the anchor of all of those island funds. For me, it struck me that collectively as a Caribbean region, we do not wrap our arms around our assets enough to really understand what is the power of this region, what are the innovations that are working well, what are the structures, what are the systems, who are the players, and to own that knowledge as a region, and then make some well-informed decisions around where gaps are, and gaps are opportunities, right? So that we can move, I think, in intentional ways. So that's definitely my call to action. And last but not least, very grateful for this conversation and hoping that it's one of many others. Because clearly there's much more to discuss. And I think to Eduardo's point, I'm certain that we all can talk about deep transformative innovations that are happening in the Caribbean that the world doesn't know about, and that can really serve to inform other places in the world. So very excited to see to engage further, and continue the conversation and collaborate in a much more cohesive way.
Thank you so much, Donna. Shanique, your final word?
Yes. I guess so much has been said already that I'd agree with from Keisha and Donna, but I think patience and a mindset set is critical. From just the little experience I have working with blended finance in the Bahamas and some of the other things around the region. Everybody wants everything to move so fast. And anybody knows the Caribbean in general, moving fast is not our strongest point.
Right.
But but I also think you know, particularly if we're talking about like the private sector engagement and bringing in these multiple forms of funding, you know, you're trying to bring together different actors who have different norms, different language, and different like measures of success. And it takes a long time to get everybody all going in the same direction and making sure we're not just going, but we actually understand what's where we're going and what we're doing. So I do think like anybody who wants to get into this space as an actor, whether you're a person who wants to be the like, you know, the receiver of blended finance, or you want to be a contributor to support others with blended finance, be realistic about timelines and the work that's really ahead that needs to be done, especially when you talk about the scale issue as well, because scale slows down things too sometimes. When you're dealing with smaller actors, you cannot overwhelm them. And we have many people in the Caribbean who are overwhelmed trying to do too many things because, you know, there's so much to be done. And then going back on 2 points that have already been mentioned, for me, I see a huge gap around technical assistance. So even with the funding that's available, it's like, here is the money, we need you to do great things, but you like, we need to walk the journey with people in a more tangible way rather than just a paycheck. So the paycheck is great, but I do think we want to think about how do we help the actors in our communities around the region to grow and understand this space. And that's both, again, the persons who are receiving, but as Keisha was mentioning, we need to get our national development banks, our credit unions, the various, even the Chamber of Commerce's, all these different actors in the Caribbean, trying to help people understand this and the opportunity for it. From both angles, from a business sense, but also from an impact sense. If you want to have impact beyond financial impact, you want to be supporting sustainable development, and the well-being of the Caribbean is so critical, and we need a lot more technical assistance for that. So more capacity and attention on that. And then last but not least, the M&E. I just think building that capacity, and that's a part of the technical assistance, so we can have more success stories to share that are from us and from our region. I think it would do so much better than listening to the stories from elsewhere or trying to figure out like, how do you take this thing from somewhere else and actually make it work in a Caribbean or small island state context. We have to put the energy in and telling the stories and get comfortable too with failure. I think like this is a big barrier we haven't mentioned. We in the Caribbean, we don't like to fail. And if we fail, we surely don't like to talk about it. And so I do think like sharing what's working as much as what's not working is a key thing to helping us grow. You're not going to grow by just focusing on everything that went well. In fact, you don't grow when you only stick to things that's your comfort zone. So that would be my call to action for persons on this call. I don't know, you know, how you're interacting with this, but I do think documenting your experience and what has worked and what has not worked and why is critical to help everybody else along the journey.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shanique. And Eduardo, last word to you.
I'm going to end with mindset. And the mindset has to be biased to scalability. And really, if anything, we need to lose the fear of bigger projects. The reality is that changing the conditions of the Caribbean is not $1 million conversation. It's in the billions. And for us to really challenge our perception that pilots need to be first, I think that this is an opportunity really to bypass the traditional way and to think about really scalability. So if anything, I think that the time together needs to be thinking about how to achieve scalability for the Caribbean and to change our mentality from millions to billions. That is what is going to be required to sustainable change for people.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining and staying with us for this extra 16 minutes of really rich conversation. Thank you, Eduardo, Shanique, Donna, and Keisha for joining us today. We've had a really engaging chat going along on the side as well. So please do, if you want to share your email address, share your conversations to keep in touch after this webinar. Hope to see that galvanizing of activity moving forward. And just a plug for Convergence. So building on the call to action for transparency and sharing success stories and sharing your activities. So we are the global network for blended finance. If you have any blended finance activities or success stories you want to share, please do share this with us. We're a nonprofit dedicated to compiling all of this information and making it digestible for the public and for our network. So again, thank you all for joining. The recording will be made available on our website in the next couple of days as well. So all the best. Have a great rest of your day.